a mother sitting in the quiet of her home, her eyes reflecting decades of memories, both beautiful and painful. Katherine Jackson, the matriarch of one of music's most iconic families, has carried secrets, defended her children, and weathered storms that would break most people. For years, the world has speculated, criticized, and judged what happened behind the closed doors of the Jackson household in Gary, Indiana. Now, in one of the most revealing moments of her life, Katherine is breaking her silence about the childhood of her most famous son, Michael Jackson, and the abuse claims that have haunted their family for generations. What she reveals will shock you, challenge everything you thought you knew, and perhaps most importantly, it will make you question whether we've been looking at the King of Pop story all wrong. This isn't just about setting the record straight. This is about a mother's truth, a son's legacy, and the fine line between discipline and abuse that defined an entire generation. In the cramped two-bedroom house on Jackson Street in Gary, Indiana, where 9 children shared space, dreams, and a destiny none of them could have imagined, the foundation of the world's greatest entertainer was being built. But at what cost? Katherine Jackson remembers those days with complexity that only a mother can understand, a mixture of pride in what her children achieved and pain over what they had to endure to get there. When she speaks about Michael's childhood now, her voice carries the weight of someone who has seen the bright lights of success cast the darkest shadows. She talks about a little boy with an extraordinary gift, a voice that could move millions, and a sensitivity that made him vulnerable to every harsh word, every strict punishment, every moment when childhood should be about play but was instead about perfection. The world knew Michael Jackson as the king of pop, the moonwalking phenomenon who broke every record and barrier imaginable. But Katherine knew him first as her 8th child, born on a late summer evening in 1958. A baby boy who would grow up too fast, perform when other kids were playing, and carry burdens that no child should ever have to bear. The Jackson family story begins long before the screaming fans and sold-out stadiums. It starts with Joe Jackson, a man whose own childhood was marked by hardship and whose determination to lift his family out of poverty became both their salvation and their source of pain. Katherine admits now, decades later, that her husband's methods were harsh. She uses words like strict, disciplined, and demanding, carefully choosing her language as she navigates the minefield between defending the man she was married to for decades and acknowledging the trauma her children experienced. Joe Jackson believed in something that was common in black households during that era, a form of parenting that emphasized obedience, respect, and consequences delivered through corporal punishment. Katherine herself said in interviews, "That's the way black people raise their children." She was referring to the use of belts, straps, and switches, physical discipline that was considered not abuse but necessary correction. But even as she explains this cultural context, there's a hesitation in her voice, a recognition that what might have been acceptable then doesn't erase the pain it caused, especially to Michael, who by all accounts bore the brunt of his father's expectations more than any of his siblings. The rehearsals in that Gary, Indiana house were legendary, not for their creativity but for their intensity. Neighbors would hear the music pounding through the thin walls for hours, sometimes starting after school and not ending until late into the night. The Jackson Five, as they would come to be known, wasn't just a family band. It was Joe Jackson's ticket out of the steel mills and poverty, and he drove his sons like a drill sergeant preparing troops for war. Michael, even at 5 and 6 years old, was already the standout, the one whose voice could make people stop and listen, the one whose natural rhythm and movement set him apart. But with that talent came pressure that would have crushed most adults, let alone a small boy who still went to bed and feared the dark. Katherine watched as Michael threw up before performances, his little body physically rejecting the stress and anxiety. She saw him cry when he made mistakes during rehearsals, knowing that perfection was the only acceptable outcome. And she witnessed the punishments, the belt coming down when steps were missed or notes were off, when Joe determined that his sons weren't giving their absolute everything. Katherine's role during these years is complicated. She was a nurturer, the soft place to land when Joe's harshness became too much. But she was also present, watching, and some would argue, complicit in allowing it to continue. When Katherine speaks about those rehearsals now, she tries to frame them in the context of their results. Look at what the children achieved. She says, 9 kids, all successful, none in jail, all contributing members of society, who became icons in music and entertainment. She points to the discipline as a reason for their success, The structure as what kept him from the streets and the drugs and the violence that claimed so many young black men in Gary during that era. And there's truth in that perspective. The Jackson 5 became Motown royalty. They had hit after hit, broke racial barriers, and became the first group to have their first 4 singles reach #1 on the Billboard charts. Michael Jackson went on to become the biggest entertainer the world has ever seen. A man whose influence transcended music and touched every corner of global culture. But Katherine's defense of the methods doesn't fully address the cost. It doesn't account for Michael's own words years later, when he sat down with Oprah Winfrey in 1993 and spoke about his childhood with tears streaming down his face. He told Oprah that he was afraid of his father, that just seeing Joe would make him feel sick, that he suffered from what he called a lost childhood, never able to play or simply be a kid, because every moment was about work, perfection, and not disappointing the man whose approval he desperately sought but rarely received. The physical abuse was one thing, but perhaps even more damaging was the emotional and psychological toll. Joe Jackson was known for making fun of Michael's appearance, particularly his nose, calling him names and mocking his acne during adolescence. For a boy already struggling with his identity and self-image, these attacks from his father were devastating. Michael would later undergo multiple plastic surgeries, a transformation that became the subject of endless speculation and ridicule. But perhaps we should have been asking not why he changed his appearance, but what made him hate his natural face so much in the first place. Katherine admits that Joe was hard on the boys, especially Michael, but she struggles with calling it abuse. In her framework, abuse is malicious, intentional cruelty meant to harm. What Joe did, in her view, was misguided discipline, harsh methods employed with the ultimate goal of their success and protection. She talked about the era they lived in, the racism of the 1960s and 70s, the reality that black children had to be twice as good to get half as far, and the belief that toughening her sons up was preparing them for a world that would show them no mercy. There's a generation gap in understanding here, a cultural divide between those who experience corporal punishment as a norm and those who now recognize it as trauma. When Michael spoke publicly about his childhood, it created a rift in the Jackson family that never fully healed. His siblings had complicated reactions. Some, like Jermaine and Marlon, defended their father, saying that yes, he was strict, but it made them who they were. Janet Jackson took a more nuanced approach, acknowledging the difficulty of their upbringing, while also recognizing her father's love and sacrifice. But Michael never backed down from his truth. He spoke about it in interviews, addressed it in therapy, and processed it through his music and his need to create Neverland Ranch, a place where he could finally live the childhood he never had, where kids could come and play and experience the joy that had been denied to him. Katherine watched her son build that fantasy world, filled with animals and amusement park rides and every toy imaginable, and she had to confront the reality that he was trying to heal wounds that had been inflicted in her home, under her watch, by the man she loved. The guilt she must feel is unimaginable, caught between loyalty to her husband and love for her son, between defending the past and acknowledging its harm. The abuse claims Katherine is addressing aren't just about the physical discipline from Joe. They also encompass the psychological damage of being thrust into superstardom as a child, the exploitation by the music industry, the pressure to be perfect, and the loss of normalcy that comes with being famous before you even understand what fame means. Michael talked often about having no friends his own age, about being surrounded by adults who wanted something from him, about performing when he was tired or sick because the show must go on, about not being able to go outside and play because fans would mob him. Katherine was there for all of it, managing schedules, handling logistics, trying to keep her family together as the world pulled them in different directions. She saw Michael's isolation grow, watched as the sensitive little boy became a withdrawn teenager, and then a reclusive adult who trusted almost no one. The pattern of his life was set so early, this idea that love was conditional, that acceptance came only through performance, that he had to be extraordinary to be worthy. No amount of therapy or success could fully undo that foundational programming. As Katherine breaks her silence now, she's also defending Michael's character and parenting. After his death in 2009, she became the guardian of his 3 children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket, now known as BG. She speaks about what an incredible father Michael was, how he was gentle and loving and present in ways that Joe never was with them. Michael learned from his own childhood what not to do, how not to make his children feel. He homeschooled them not just for privacy, but to give them the normal education he never had. He took them on adventures, played with them, and let them be kids without the pressure to perform or be perfect. Katherine sees in Michael's parenting the proof of his goodness, evidence that despite everything he endured, he broke the cycle and gave his children the childhood he wished he'd had. The tragedy, of course, is that Michael's time with his children was cut short, that the years of stress and trauma and physical toll from performing eventually contributed to his death at just 50 years old. Katherine is now raising her grandchildren the way she wishes she could have raised her own kids, with less pressure, more freedom, and the understanding that childhood is precious and should be protected, not sacrificed for any dream, no matter how grand. The cultural conversation around discipline versus abuse has evolved dramatically since the Jackson 5 were rehearsing in Gary. What was once considered normal, even necessary, parenting is now recognized as potentially traumatic. Studies on child development and psychology have shown that corporal punishment, especially when harsh and frequent, can lead to anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and difficulty in relationships later in life. All of these issues plagued Michael throughout his adult life. He struggled with trust, suffered from severe anxiety and insomnia, had complicated relationships, and displayed behaviors that many psychologists would attribute to childhood trauma. Katherine is being forced to reckon with this new understanding, to look back at her choices and her husband's actions through a modern lens that condemns what they once considered acceptable. It's not easy for her. She's in her 90s now, a deeply religious woman who has always believed in traditional values, family loyalty, and the idea that you don't air your dirty laundry publicly. But the world has been talking about her family's dirty laundry for decades, and Michael's own words made it impossible to keep pretending that everything was fine. One of the most painful aspects of Katherine's breaking silence is addressing whether she could have done more to protect her children, specifically Michael. As a mother, that question must haunt her. In the framework of her time and her understanding, she did protect them. She was the buffer between Joe's harshness and the children's emotional needs. She provided comfort and love and stability in a chaotic household. She fought for them when she could and made sure they knew they were loved even when they were being disciplined. But through a modern lens, through Michael's own testimony, it's clear that her protection wasn't enough. She didn't stop the rehearsals that went too late or the punishments that went too far. She didn't stand between Joe and the children when the belt came out. She didn't insist that they get to have normal childhoods with school and friends and play instead of being on the road performing in nightclubs where adult things were happening that children shouldn't witness. Katherine's explanations for this often center on the realities of her marriage and her era. She was a woman in a time when wives didn't challenge their husband's authority, especially not in front of the children. She believed in Joe's vision, saw the opportunities he was creating, and perhaps convinced herself that the ends would justify the means. The question of whether Joe Jackson's methods were necessary for the Jackson children's success is one that Katherine still wrestles with. Would Michael Jackson have become the king of pop without that brutal training? Would the Jackson 5 have achieved what they did without Joe's relentless drive and discipline? It's impossible to know, but what we do know is that talent will find a way. Michael's gift was undeniable. His voice, his instinct for performance, his creativity, and his work ethic as an adult were all internal to him, not beaten into him. Many incredibly successful artists come from supportive, nurturing backgrounds where discipline was about structure and encouragement rather than fear and punishment. The idea that abuse is necessary for greatness is not only false but dangerous. It perpetuates cycles of trauma and gives abusers justification for their actions. Katherine, in her breaking silence, seems to be coming to terms with this, acknowledging that while the outcomes were extraordinary, the methods were painful and perhaps unnecessary. She speaks about Joe with less certainty now than she did years ago, less defensiveness, and more acknowledgement that things could have been different, should have been different. Michael's relationship with his father never fully healed before Joe's death in 2018. There were attempts at reconciliation, moments where Michael expressed understanding for the pressures his father faced and the intentions behind his actions, but the hurt ran too deep. The physical and emotional abuse had fractured something fundamental in their relationship, and despite moments of connection, and Michael's mature understanding that his father was a product of his own difficult upbringing, they never achieved the closeness that both, in their own ways, seemed to want. Katherine was caught in the middle of this complicated dynamic for decades, loving both her husband and her son, understanding both perspectives, but unable to fully bridge the gap between them. Joe never apologized, never admitted to abuse, and continued to defend his parenting methods until the day he died. When Oprah asked him directly if he regretted the physical discipline, he said no, that his children's success and the fact that none of them ended up in jail proved he did the right thing. That response broke something in Michael and made healing impossible. How do you reconcile with someone who won't acknowledge your pain, who sees your trauma as justified, who takes credit for your success but no responsibility for your suffering? Katherine's breaking silence also touches on the broader issue of child stars and the exploitation inherent in the entertainment industry. The Jackson Five were working professionally before they were teenagers, performing in adult venues, dealing with adult pressures, and having their childhoods commodified. Motown, while giving them incredible opportunities, also worked them relentlessly, touring schedules that were grueling for adults, let alone children. The money they earned in those early years largely went to their parents and managers, not to them. Michael spoke about this later, the feeling of being used, of being valuable only for what he could produce, not for who he was as a person. Katherine was part of this system, managing her children's careers alongside Joe, making decisions about their time and their earnings, and prioritizing success over childhood. The industry hasn't changed enough. We still see child stars burning out, suffering from mental health issues, struggling with addiction, and dealing with the aftermath of having their youth stolen from them. Katherine's story with Michael is a cautionary tale about the cost of early fame and the responsibility parents have to protect their children even from lucrative opportunities. In her most recent interviews and statements, Katherine has shown an evolution in her thinking. She's not completely recanting her defense of Joe or admitting to abuse in a way that some people want her to. But there's a softness now, an acknowledgement of pain, and a recognition that the methods used to raise her children were damaging to Michael in ways that success couldn't compensate for. She talks about wishing Michael could have had a normal childhood, about the sadness of seeing him try to recapture what was lost through Neverland Ranch and his relationships with children, which became so misconstrued and used against him. She speaks with deep regret about the controversy and accusations that plague his later years, the false allegations of child abuse that she vehemently denies, but that were in some ways a twisted echo of his own lost innocence and obsession with childhood. Katherine maintains absolutely that Michael never harmed a child, that his love for children came from his own stolen youth, and his desire to give others what he never had. The accusations, the trials, the public humiliation were tortures that compounded his childhood trauma and eventually, she believes, contributed to his death. When Michael died on June 25, 2009, Katherine lost not just a son but her protector, her financial support, and the person who, despite all his struggles, always made sure she was taken care of. The grief she felt and continues to feel is complicated by all of this history. She mourns the child who was too sensitive for the world he was born into, the teenager who cried alone in hotel rooms between performances, the adult who sought healing in all the wrong places and from all the wrong people, and the father who finally found peace and purpose in raising his own children. Katherine's breaking silence is in many ways her processing of this grief, her attempt to tell the full story before she's gone, to defend her son's legacy while also acknowledging the painful truths of how he got to where he got. She wants the world to know that Michael was a good person, that he was damaged by his childhood but not defined by it, that he gave more love and joy and art to the world than most people could even comprehend, and that the real abuse he suffered wasn't just in his childhood home, but in the media's treatment of him, the industry's exploitation of him, and the public's willingness to believe the worst about someone they didn't truly know. The Jackson family dynamics remain complicated to this day. Michael's siblings have their own relationships with the past, their own stories of what happened in that house in Gary, their own feelings about Joe's discipline and Katherine's role. Some have been more outspoken than others. La Toya wrote a book detailing abuse in the family before recanting and reconciling. Janet has spoken carefully about her difficult upbringing, while also expressing love for her parents. The brothers who performed alongside Michael have given interviews defending their father, while also acknowledging that Michael's experience may have been different more intense, more damaging because of his sensitivity and his status as a star. Katherine has had to navigate these different narratives, try and keep her family together even as they process their shared trauma in different ways. The public nature of their dysfunction has made healing even harder. Every statement is scrutinized, every interview analyzed, every family gathering photographed and speculated about. They can't process their past privately because their past is part of pop culture history. What makes Katherine's breaking silence so significant is that it's coming from the one person who was there for all of it, who loved Michael from his first breath, who watched his transformation from a talented little boy to a global phenomenon to a broken man, and who is now raising his children and trying to give them the stability and normalcy their father craved. Her perspective is unique and essential to understanding the full picture of Michael Jackson's life. For years, the narrative was controlled by others, by the media, by Joe Jackson's defensiveness, by Michael's carefully crafted public image, and by the accusations and controversies that overshadowed his humanity. Katherine's voice, the voice of his mother, adds a layer of truth that's been missing. She's not excusing the harm, but she's explaining the context. She's not denying Michael's pain, but she's defending his character. She's not rewriting history, but she's adding her version of events to the historical record. Whether people accept her perspective or not, whether they believe discipline can ever justify the outcome, or whether they see the Jackson family story as a tragedy masquerading as success is up to individual interpretation. The generational divide in how people respond to Katherine's statements is significant. Older generations, particularly those from communities where corporal punishment was a norm, tend to be more sympathetic to her defense of Joe's methods. They understand the cultural context, the era's different standards, and the belief that harsh discipline was love and action, preparation for a cruel world. Younger generations, raised with more awareness of trauma and child psychology, tend to be more critical, seeing the Jackson children as victims of abuse who achieved success despite their childhood, not because of it. Social media has amplified these debates, with people passionately arguing both sides. Some call Katherine an enabler, someone who should have protected her children better, and who is now trying to rewrite history to absolve herself of guilt. Others see her as a woman of her time doing the best she could with the understanding she had, a loving mother who made mistakes but whose intentions were never to harm. The truth, as with most complex human stories, is probably somewhere in the middle. Michael Jackson's legacy is forever intertwined with his childhood trauma. You cannot separate the art from the artist, the moonwalk from the lost childhood, the record-breaking albums from the little boy who was afraid of his father. His music often reflected his pain. Songs like Childhood directly addressing what he went through and asking people not to judge what they don't understand. In his short film for Thriller, the transformation and horror elements can be seen as metaphors for his own experience of childhood as something terrifying. Man in the Mirror was about personal change and looking at oneself honestly, something Michael did constantly, always questioning, always seeking healing, never quite finding it. His humanitarian work, his efforts to help children around the world, his creation of the Heal the World Foundation, all of this came from his own wounds and his desire to make sure other children didn't suffer as he had. Katherine sees all of this, understands that her son channeled his pain into purpose, and that makes the loss of him even more profound. The world lost an extraordinary artist, but she lost a son who never fully healed, who carried his childhood with him every day, and who died too young in part because of the toll that trauma takes on a body and mind over decades. As Katherine Jackson breaks her silence on these abuse claims, she's also asking for understanding and forgiveness, not just for Joe, but for herself. She's asking people to see her as a mother who loved her children deeply, who made choices within the constraints of her marriage, her era, and her understanding, and who lives now with the knowledge that those choices had consequences she couldn't have fully anticipated. She's asking that Michael be remembered not as a victim, but as a survivor, not as someone broken beyond repair, but as someone who, despite everything, created beauty and joy and brought people together across every possible divide. She wants his children, her grandchildren, to know their father as the loving, gentle, creative soul he was with them, not to be defined by the tabloid headlines or the controversies or the tragic end. Katherine's breaking silence is her final gift to her son, her attempt to tell his story with the nuance and complexity it deserves, to defend him where he cannot defend himself, and to admit truths that she perhaps couldn't face while he was alive. The conversation Katherine Jackson has started by breaking her silence extends far beyond her own family. It touches on fundamental questions about parenting, about the difference between discipline and abuse, about cultural norms and how they evolve, about the price of fame and success, about the exploitation of children in the entertainment industry, and about how we as a society treat our most vulnerable members. Michael Jackson's story is extreme in its circumstances, but not unique in its themes. There are countless children pushed too hard by ambitious parents, countless young performers exploited by an industry that values profit over well-being, countless people walking around with childhood trauma that shapes their adult lives in ways they can't escape. Katherine's willingness to finally speak openly, even with a defensive framing and careful language, opens a door for these broader conversations. It challenges us to think about what we accept as normal in parenting, how we protect children in professional settings, and how we can break cycles of trauma rather than perpetuating them in the name of tradition or success. In the end, Katherine Jackson's breaking silence on Michael's childhood and the abuse claims is a story about love and pain existing simultaneously, about good intentions leading to harmful outcomes, about the complexity of family and the impossibility of judging someone else's choices without walking in their shoes. It's about a mother's guilt and a son's trauma, about a family's private pain becoming public spectacle, and about the ongoing struggle to define what happened and what it meant. Katherine will never satisfy everyone with her version of events. Those who see Joe Jackson as an abuser will continue to see her as complicit. Those who understand the cultural and historical context will continue to defend her. Those who love Michael will continue to mourn the childhood he never had and the demons he could never fully escape. But what Katherine's breaking silence does is add her voice to the record, give her perspective a platform, and ensure that when history tells the story of Michael Jackson and the price of his extraordinary gifts, his mother's words are part of that telling. Whether we agree with her or not, whether we forgive or condemn, whether we see tragedy or triumph when we look at the Jackson family story, we cannot now say we didn't hear from the woman who was there from the beginning, who loved them all through everything, and who carries the weight of those Gary, Indiana days in her heart until her final breath.